Why on earth isn't everyone on stage at the same time? Is that really too much to ask? Let's find out. Hi there, I'm Giles Goff. I'm an education writer and a recovering English teacher. And today we're going to be doing a very quick, very basic plot summary of An Inspector Calls. So whenever I'm looking at a play or any story for that matter, I like to break it down into 10 steps. That helps for me to keep it straight in my mind. So I will put all these in the description if you need to copy and paste them out of there. But this is a very quick whistle-stop tour of the plot. Okay, here we go. Mr. and Mrs Birling are with their children, Sheila and Eric, as well as Gerald Croft. They are celebrating Sheila and Gerald's engagement. Suddenly, an Inspector Goole, arrives investigating the suicide of a young woman named Eva Smith. Eva worked in one of Mr. Birling's factories but was fired after being involved in a strike, in particular leading a strike. Mr. Birling denies any responsibility for her death as these events took place well over a year ago. The inspector then focuses his attention on Sheila. After leaving Mr. Birling's factory, Eva worked at a shop called Millward's, like a high-end sort of clothing shop, but she was fired following a complaint from Sheila, who was jealous of Eva's looks. Eva hadn't said anything. Sheila interpreted Eva looking a particular way as an insult to her. And then the inspector reveals that Eva Smith then changed her name to Daisy Renton. And it's clear that Gerald recognises this name. Eva Smith might have been a stranger to him, but he definitely knows who Daisy Renton is. He denies it, but his fiancée, Sheila, she notices his reaction and she presses him on it. He admits that he knew her, but asks Sheila to hide it from the inspector. Sheila laughs and she says, "You fool, he already knows." So that leads us then into Act 2. So the inspector questions Gerald, who admits that Daisy was his mistress. They were lovers for a number of weeks, months, but he eventually broke it off. Sheila is shocked by this and she calls off the engagement to Gerald. Gerald leaves the house to go for a walk, and later Eric also leaves. And the inspector says that Daisy went to a charity for help. The charity was chaired by Mrs Birling, and where at that point it turns out that Daisy, or Eva, was pregnant, she was unemployed, and she had nobody to turn to. Mrs Birling turned her away because she thought Daisy was impertinent. If you remember, Eva switches her name to Daisy Renton, and at this point she calls herself Mrs Birling, and for some reason Mrs Birling is shocked and appalled at the idea that somebody might have the same name as her, so she turns her away with nothing. And Mrs Birling has no regrets about turning her away and refusing help because she says that Daisy was a liar. Sheila tries to stop Mrs Birling, but Mrs Birling is insistent that it's the father of the child, the one who'd sort of abandoned Daisy, that should be punished. Which then takes us into Act 3, and I think you can probably guess who the father of the child is. It's Eric. Eric returns and explains that he had had a fling with Daisy. She becomes... Fling sounds too nice a way of putting it because it doesn't sound 100% consensual at some point. We will get into that on the Eric video. But for now, he and Daisy had a sexual relationship. She became pregnant and he tried to help her by giving her money stolen from his father's business, Birling and Company. The inspector then wraps up his investigation. He says he now knows all he needs to know. He tells them they all contributed to Eva's suicide, and then, after an absolutely stirring speech, he leaves. Eric and Sheila feel convicted. They feel terrible about what they did and the part they played in it. But the Birlings, all they are concerned about is avoiding a scandal. At this point, Gerald returns from his walk and he tells them that he met a constable who didn't know any Inspector Goole on the force there. So they telephone the infirmary. Infirmary is like another word for hospital. They also find out there's been no suicide. So the Birlings celebrate, but Eric and Sheila can't quite forget their actions and they still feel unsettled. Gerald seems to be apparently fine. In fact, he says, "What about this ring?" He's wondering, should the engagement be back on? Suddenly a telephone rings. Suddenly a telephone rings and Mr. Birling answers it. He's told that a girl has just died from suicide and that an inspector is on his way to ask them some questions. Dun, dun, dun. So there's the plot in 10 easy steps. Like I say, I will put that in the description, so if you need to copy and paste it out of there, that's absolutely fine. Another key term I wanted to talk about is the inciting incident. So an inciting incident is the event that the main characters will have to deal with throughout the narrative. If you see the Birlings, and I think more specifically Sheila as the main character, then we can see the arrival of the inspector being the inciting incident, the thing that kicks off the plot there. The last thing I want to talk about, why are they not all on stage at the same time? Well, quite simply, it's practicality. Actors need a break sometimes. If you are performing for 2 hours, you need to let people get off stage so they can have a breather, go to the toilet, maybe if they're struggling, really furiously look over their lines, whatever they need to do. It's one of the things you need to factor in when looking at a play, is that it's not just a work of fiction as such. It's not just a work of imagination. It's also a blueprint for how an event is practically going to be staged. If they're on stage, they need to have something to do. Actors hate it when they're on stage and they've got nothing to do but just stand there, because all they've got to do is react to stuff, and that's quite difficult to look shocked and surprised when you know all the things that are coming, and it's you have to give them lines, you have to give them something to do. So if they don't need to be there, then get them away. It also gives the chance for a recap. Every time a new character comes back in, it gives you a chance to say, oh, this is what happened. And because an Inspector Goole is a really wordy play, if you think about it, it is literally just people talking in a room. There is no love scenes, there's no fight scenes, there's nothing. It's just people talking in a room. So it's possible an audience member's mind can just wander. This gives a chance for a recap. And lastly, from a narrative perspective, it helps to build dramatic tension. That whole scene about Daisy, Eva Smith, going to Mrs Birling would play hugely differently if Eric was in the room the whole time. Because we get to the point where we know something that Eric doesn't, and then we see Eric learn that his mother is the one that turned away Eva Smith and effectively killed her and her unborn grandchild. So there we go. What do you think about the plot? Why do you think it ends like that? I've got some theories. We will talk about it in a later video. Do you think it's a satisfying ending? Is there any way you would change it? How would you do it differently? Let's talk about it in the comments. I hope that has proved useful and that's given you something for your essays. Please click like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.